Hi, I'm Dan Vermeer. I'm an associate professor of the practice at Fuqua School of Business and the executive director for the Center for Energy Development and the Global Environment. I'm really excited to be here and speak with you today about the COVID crisis and its connections to multiple adjacent challenges that we face. In this case, I'm going to focus a lot on climate change. I'm going to pull up my slides and I'll be going back and forth with you to explore this a bit, and I look forward to the questions that you have at the end of this session. Climate change doesn't get a lot of front page headlines in the midst of this pandemic, as people are more focused on public health, obviously. But public health and climate change are actually really closely linked. And our attempts to address these issues in this context offer a unique opportunity to think about how we might use the pandemic to inflect the path of climate change and put us on the path to a sustainable recovery. So I'd like to discuss a few questions with you today. The first is, how much carbon do we emit and where does it come from? The second is, what impact has the pandemic had on our emissions trajectory? And the third is, what strategies could we pursue to flatten the climate curve? So I'd like to start today with a story about a recent YouTube video that I saw with the woman who's shown here, where a woman in the present is talking to her pre-pandemic self in January. In this video, Julie from today gets to compare notes with her former self and tells her that, well, there's good news and there's bad news. January Julie asks, what's the bad news? And so current Julie responds, I can't tell you everything, but you will want to pull out all your investments, do a big Costco run, get a dog, and stock up on sourdough starter. So January Julie then asks, well, what's the good news? And current Julie's face lights up as she says in a really cheery tone, things have never been better for climate change. So today I'd like to shed some light on whether this is actually true or not. So where do our emissions come from? You can see in this diagram that transportation makes up about 14% of our emissions, and that's actually where the biggest impact of the pandemic has been felt so far. But even with big reductions in our car trips and our flights, most emissions actually come from other sectors. So for example, electricity and heating are about 25% of our emissions. Utilities still generate about the same amount of electricity, even if it's shifted a bit from workplaces to homes. Industry makes up about another 20%. So processes like aluminum and steel production are carbon intensive, and those are also continuing at relatively similar rates as before. And agriculture and forestry, the ways we grow our food and use our land, also have major impacts. So COVID is interesting from a climate perspective because it's a natural experiment on a grand scale. It allows us, it varies multiple emission-related factors, including electricity, transportation, food systems, and land use. And we can measure the cause and effect globally, and we can compare trends across time as restrictions are varying. And this experiment is actually really similar to what we've heard for a long time from climate activists, that we need to change our behavior by cutting our emissions, drive less, cancel flights, reduce consumption. Is this a recipe for solving climate change? Now we actually have some ability to answer that question. So we can see from this chart that the pandemic has had a major impact on carbon emissions in the last 5 months. Starting in January in China, we see sharp declines in CO2 emissions, rapidly followed by the rest of the world in March. And then by early April, daily fossil fuel emissions were 17% lower than they were in 2019, as governments ordered people to stay home, employees stopped driving to work, factories idled, and airlines ground to a halt. But by mid-June, countries began to ease these restrictions and emissions ticked back up to just 5% below what they were in 2019. And in China, emissions appear to have completely returned to the 2019 levels that we saw before. So with all this global volatility, we expect that climate emissions will be reduced about 8% in 2020, which is the level that it was in actually about 10 years ago. So this is not to be minimized. This is by far the biggest reduction we've seen in carbon emissions since World War II. Unfortunately, it's not going to have a discernible effect on long-term climate change. Well, why is that? One of the main reasons is that when we've seen these kinds of recessions and other kinds of shocks in the past, after the crisis passes, emissions go back to what they were before. We don't see changes because nothing is fundamentally changed in the way that we live our lives. We haven't changed the structure of how our system operates. And that's true with the pandemic too. The majority of our emissions are structural, not based just on personal decisions. So we have the same cars, the same power plants, the same industries that we had before. And without big structural changes, we're likely to go back to the way that we were before. I want to dig into this just a bit more by sharing a metaphor that you sometimes hear climate scientists use on this, which is the metaphor of a bathtub. Not many people understand this aspect of climate change, that it's the short-term changes in emissions actually have little impact on long-term dynamics of the carbon cycle. So scientists compare CO2 in the atmosphere to water flowing into a leaky bathtub, as you can see in this diagram. If you think of CO2 coming from the faucet in emissions, but also volcanoes and from plants and animals, that flow over time fills the bathtub. And some of that is then absorbed by oceans and forests that are shown at the bottom of this diagram. And so what the lockdown means is that the tap has been turned down slightly, but that CO2 is still streaming into the bathtub. Even with the dramatic changes that we've seen, we'll still emit about 35 billion tons of CO2 into the atmosphere this year. And until we cut these emissions to net zero, so that all the emissions that are flowing into the atmosphere are actually equal to those flowing out, then the Earth will continue to warm. And that's the situation that we find ourselves now. In our case, pre-industrial levels of carbon were about 270 units per million. We're now looking at about 417 parts per million in the atmosphere after centuries of industrialization. And so even though the tap has been slightly adjusted, the bathtub is now close to overflowing. That's why we're seeing in 2020, we're now on track to have this be the warmest year on record, like many of the last years have been over the last couple of decades. And so, in a sad irony, the lack of air pollution has actually created higher temperatures at the surface of the planet. So some of the positive impacts that we've had from the pandemic play out in terms of actually increased temperatures. So what does the pandemic show us about addressing climate change? I think the main message is that the scale of change required is massive. This year's cuts will result in about 8% total reduction, but at enormous economic and social costs. We need to achieve similar kinds of reductions every year from now till 2050 to reduce the chances of really bad outcomes, in a sense, to bend the climate curve. But we also know that the costs of inaction from flooded real estate and damaged food systems will be even higher. So we have no choice but to act. The second lesson, I think, is that relying just on personal choices and reduced consumption alone is not sufficient. We need these big structural changes. Those often happen at the level of public policy and public investment. So we need to really think broadly about where we can get leverage on these issues at scale. And the third is that these efforts have to span all sectors and all geographies, that the strategy has to be long-term and structural. So before I talk about the opportunities, I want to talk about that, in fact, this is going to be harder for three reasons. One is that there's less enthusiasm for public transportation because people are prioritizing public safety over emissions reductions. Local and national governments also have really strained budgets, so getting the resources to invest in these long-term structural challenges certainly are there. And people are distracted as public health and school openings and those kinds of issues are really front and center for people. And so as a long-term proponent for climate action, um, I want to share a cartoon that sums up, I think, nicely the kinds of feelings that I often have when you think about this climate crisis. You know, just as we've attempted to flatten the curve of COVID infections, we need to also flatten that curve of climate emissions. And I think here's the real key takeaway that I'd like to share with you, that the urgency of addressing climate change can't wait until after we conquer this pandemic. And in fact, the opportunity here is that our recovery from the pandemic may provide unique opportunities to inflect the curve of carbon emissions in really unique ways. Some of my colleagues at MIT have talked about the need to multisolve, to be able to develop holistic plans of action that simultaneously address multiple challenges. And I think that's really a kind of core capability. As an educator, I think about the need to prepare our students to tackle these kind of wicked problems like public health, climate change, even racial justice, in ways that recognize how they're connected and how our actions may actually be directed to impacting all of them simultaneously. In fact, we're seeing some of these ideas emerge as we look around the world in the post-pandemic kind of recovery plans or stimulus plans that are emerging in many cities, states, and countries. The aspiration to build back better. And I think we've also realized that we're capable of more change faster than we ever expected, and that the public's ready for it. I saw a study recently that showed about 71% of the global population believes that climate change is as urgent as the pandemic to solve. So I think there's a level of readiness for people to address this issue. I'd like to move on to the good news, because I think there is real good news here. The good news is that we have a lot of tools to choose from. Project Drawdown is one of my favorite initiatives that's happening right now, led by John Foley. Project Drawdown has done a really large-scale evaluation of all the tools that we can use to reduce or capture the carbon emissions that are being released into the atmosphere. And the table here shows the top 10 solutions that we have available that have the most potential to inflect the kind of growth in carbon emissions. So from the typical ones that we see around renewables, onshore wind turbines, utility scale photovoltaics, they add to a list a whole set of other solutions that are not talked about nearly as much: reducing food waste, plant-rich diets, and health and education. In this case, really focusing on the education of women and girls as a very powerful lever at reducing emissions over time. And so by expanding this menu, Drawdown's now working with a coalition of companies to turn these ideas and translate them into profitable business opportunities. For example, who are the customers that are willing to pay for food waste solutions? What technologies can be used to solve these problems? Where are the most promising market opportunities, and how do we scale these opportunities? So these are the kind of questions that feel like really bread and butter MBA kinds of questions, ones that their skill sets are really well suited for. And that they are in a great position, I think, to really build the many multi-billion-dollar businesses that we need to be able to address this crisis. So I'd like to spend the last few minutes here looking at some of the elements of the green recovery plans that we're seeing around the world, because they have several similarities that I think are quite interesting. What you find as you look at these plans that are emerging at all levels of government around the world is that they all make a priority to make transformative investments in creating green jobs with living wages. They focus on accelerating a transition to off of fossil fuels and toward renewables. They empower the public to have a say in public investments, policies, and bailouts. And they make society and economy more resilient to the inevitable kind of shocks to the system we're likely to see down the road. So what are some of the specific elements here? Some of them are obvious sort of extrapolations from the experience we've had through the pandemic. So things like more telecommuting that reduces energy use, reduces carbon emissions, reduces traffic congestion. That's a win all the way around for climate change. And so some of these will bounce back, but I have faith that actually a lot of the things that we've done during the pandemic will hold on. I spoke to one of our board members recently from National Grid, who said that their whole call center was transitioned to online during the pandemic crisis, and it's worked so well that only half of those employees are going to return to the headquarters. The other half are going to continue to work remotely. I think this is an example of what we're seeing across the entire economy. Another area is to really rethink on transportation, and the effort is how do we bring back transportation modes that have the same ability to meet people's needs without the accompanying kinds of emissions that go with it. So cities like New York, Milan, and Mexico City are unveiling plans to convert large portions of their roadways to bicycle traffic for some of the time, or in the case of Bogota, Colombia, converting large parts of the city to full-time bicycle use. Cities are also looking at how do they make it possible for essential workers to get to work without using public transportation or their personal cars. So really creative thinking about how do we reorient our transportation system. Another area is around transforming our infrastructure, focusing on residential improvements. Now that we live at home, I think people are really sensitized to all the things that we can do to decarbonize our power supply, reduce fossil fuel use in homes for heating, do weatherizing, and the whole set of things that can reduce energy use, but also for public buildings, that many of which are empty now. This is a great opportunity to get into them and make them energy efficient for the long term. They're looking at creating more park space, which not only is helpful in improving health, but can reduce heat in dense urban centers. And they're looking at reorienting in public investments in pensions in things like solar and wind power. And finally, they're trying to connect the dots between human health, social and racial justice, and environmental effects. One simple example we've seen with the COVID crisis, that the worst concentrations of cases are happening where people are poor, in communities that are largely people of color. And so our strategies to recover from the crisis have to account for not only the changes in our energy system, but also the changes in society that we want to see. So in conclusion, I'd like to just say, I'm optimistic. The pandemic crisis has been a catalyst for long-lasting change in the ways that we live, work, travel, and organize our communities. And that COVID has highlighted the connections between all of these different areas, all of which are in need of really systems thinking. I really liked a quote from Kim Stanley Robinson, who's a science fiction writer, writing in the New Yorker recently. He said, "The virus is rewriting our imaginations. What felt impossible has become thinkable. We're getting a different sense of our place in history. We know we're entering a new world, a new era. So let's not waste this opportunity." Thanks. This is just a little bit of a taste of what I see as sort of promising new opportunities in the wake of the pandemic to address things like climate change. And I'd love to open up the table to questions and for discussion. So I'll turn it over to you. So one of the things that I've seen happening over the last few months that I think is really interesting is that there are new options in terms of long-term energy solutions that we haven't heard much about until now. Hydrogen is one of the ones that I've begun to track pretty closely, because there's a real need for long-term energy-dense storage that can be utilized when and where it's needed, and which can play a role in kind of long haul kind of trucking applications and other parts of the energy system that have been hard to decarbonize until now. So up till now, we've seen a lot of interest in solar and wind, particularly as the costs have dropped. I think there's a real clear line of sight about how we make those kinds of investments. But we know that there's a number of these other sort of pieces of the puzzle around industrial energy use, around long haul trucking and transportation, around shipping that really need new solutions. And so I'm excited to see what's happening in this space. I'm also really excited about the role that our students can play in addressing some of these things. I've got a question coming in here. So a question I think that's on a lot of people's minds. Just prior to the pandemic, we heard a lot of discussion around Blackrock's challenge to the companies that they invest in about their need to, one, have a purpose, and two, that they were going to pay a lot of attention to companies' efforts to really decarbonize their operations and supply chains. And I hear a lot of people worried that that may have been sidetracked by the pandemic, that those kind of priorities may have shifted given the kind of focus on the pandemic. I don't see that happening in the conversations that I've had with the company executives that I work with. They don't see any kind of relenting in terms of the kind of long-term considerations that investors are giving to these issues of environment, social and governance behavior on the part of firms. And so certainly I think there's going to be a challenge in finding the kind of financial resources to make these big investments. But in terms of the kind of pressures that companies feel around this, I think they see those as the kind of long-term realities of the market environment that are not going to change and which are going to be every bit as strong at a point that we come out of this. Listening to Cam Harvey's last presentation, you know, he expects that when there is a vaccine that we're likely to see a strong economic recovery. And so I think that means two things. One is those pressures are likely to come back every bit as strong as they were before. And second of all, I think that's the moment where we have to think about, do we rebuild using the same carbon intensive and resource intensive systems that we've had in the past? Or do we really think in a creative way about how do we build new systems? So some of the challenge here, I think, is also a big opportunity for us to rethink those issues. I'm going to take a look and see if we have other questions here. Yeah, so Dan Brewer asks, what's the best way to engage large companies in policy advocacy? Yeah, we spent a lot of time looking at that. I think there are risks for companies to take individual stands on these issues, and I actually think that that's risky for companies to, at least in this environment, to take individual stands. I think by recognizing the systemic nature of these challenges, you really have to build coalitions around these issues. So what I am most interested in is the groups of companies that have come together around specific challenges, whether that's around decarbonization. There's a lot of efforts right now, and there are some real leaders in that space. So Microsoft, for example, recently committed to eliminate not only all of their current emissions, but all of their historic emissions going back to the 1970s. So Microsoft is a big leader in this area, but they're also looking at how to partner with other companies to advance a kind of policy agenda. You know, I think we've seen a lot of volatility in the policy arena, and it's risky for companies to try to play that too closely. So many companies, I think, over the last 4 years, even as US policy has de-emphasized things like decarbonization, I don't think the companies have actually followed that. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there. Ben Spiker asks, can we talk a little bit more about the education of women and girls as a key to reducing emissions? Yeah, I think this is a really great example of what systems thinking can offer. They may not seem immediately connected, but one of the primary drivers of carbon emissions obviously are large populations. And one of the factors that's most effective in reducing the size of families globally is to educate women and girls. And the more education they have, the more ability they have to have control over their own reproductive choices. And you see a shift as countries develop, particularly with women and girls, toward wanting to provide a really high quality education and being satisfied with less children. So those things kind of go together. If you have less children, you have more resources to invest in the children that you do have. And what we're seeing is pretty large drops in population in many parts of the world. Of course, that's going to be different. Africa is likely to still grow pretty robustly over the coming decades, but many parts of the world we're seeing a really rapid sort of slowing down in population growth, and that's the most effective way. The smaller families require much less resources, and as those families develop, that has an enormous impact on the whole energy system that we need to provide. So that's the primary way that education of women and girls can be a really effective kind of driver for addressing these questions. Ilana, okay, I'll take one more question. Ilana Mayed asks, how do we frame the case for climate change mitigation without sounding dismissive of health concerns and companies trying to get back on their feet and stay afloat? Yeah, I think that's a really tricky question. I think most companies do understand that there's, in their strategy, short-term and long-term elements. And I think despite the kind of pressures they're going to have on, short-term profitability and expectations from investors, I think companies are in it for the long haul. And so I think it's fair to acknowledge and recognize that these issues in addressing COVID are critical. I think the other part of this is to really be able to connect the dots, that it's not a choice between addressing climate change and related issues and COVID, but to find really creative strategies that, in a sense, have an ability to affect both of those things. So I think we have to get a lot better about that narrative. I think we need to recognize where people's minds are and the everyday concerns that are front and center for them. But I think we can play a role in helping them to kind of connect the dots between things that may seem like they're conflicts or trade-offs, and actually see the ways that they fit together. So I think that's the vision. I think there's a lot of work for us all to do on that. But I'm excited that, that conversation is happening in lots of parts of the world already. Many of you, I think, have the opportunity to try to help shape that dialogue. So I'd like to conclude by thanking you all for joining us today. These conversations happen every Wednesday. And next week, my colleague Cam Harvey will be back to discuss how COVID-19 is impacting our financial markets. So please join for that. Please follow Fuqua on LinkedIn. Stay safe and see you all soon, either online or in person. Thanks, everybody.